三界觉度说了专注把路的人家所知道也真正一别从旁听多了便知三界主三界觉度所见说了专注把路的人家所知道也真正一别从旁听多了便知三界主三界觉度所见说了专注把路的人家所知道也真正一别从旁听多了便知三界两情可是你们落就学了，我的研究去。啊，맞아. 나 지금 동부 뒤지해 줘. 동부 정말. 어디? 디지디 가정님한테 답사래. 지상 예버티 철루니 마르시에버터 리비 같이 지레 버차도 쇼라스. 다 더베타서 마힘바시에디. 왜그 왜니 요바시에디 간지지리 시기 유메디다 고아차고 제스다 디 바게타 티비키제로
to the Lamrim the Great Treatise on the Stage of the Path to Enlightenment, here it says, seek certainty in the following manner, as explained before, form a clear mental image of the object to be refuted by reasoning. So this is Dijla saying, in order to get some understanding, some sense or some notion of what does it mean to exist, or what hypothetically would mean to exist if something were to exist without depending on mere interpretation by conceptual consciousness.
이 로션 제 창의지기 된지기 고라 창의지기 아니 수수이기 단 이버디 ran 유지 마지베 신 지들 조다바나 레버samla 고심버 자선다 수수이기 아니 마리버디 랑문이 유버 진당디 로텐제디 니친기 유버디 아니 문진체버레시디 아니 마시에디 차술라 간제도 차사디 가와도 간제지 차기도 가리 차기도 아니 간제지 차기도 스난다 디기토네 수수기 로텐제디를 문을 두고 징기 유버디 원체버지체스
So then, after having done so, then the text continues saying, so then for that you should contemplate well and identify the intrinsically existent person superimposed by the ignorance in your mental continuum. So this word for that, according to Geshe-Lai's explanation, should not be there because he talked about it in a sequence. So therefore, what you've done previously, the sentence right before, you should contemplate well after that. And so Geshe-Lai explained that after you have a clear mental image of the object to be refuted, then you should identify your own innate mental grasping, become aware of that, and get a sense how this apprehends the object of meditation. How does the self appear to that mind? What appears? How does it appear? So it's identifying the mode of appearance, what appears, how it appears. So this is what this next sentence says. You should contemplate well.
제산타 갈라브레 진짜 충분히나 아니 대 구마지 요래래도 구마디 간지지 요래서 구마디 미지리에서 해야 구마디 예 가서 테스트 샤자바시도 생겨서로 근데 숍스 마들 이거 말아 다 디레신 주구주구도 거라 디지도 다 단진세의 간지를 센터는 숍스 많이 뭐지 수지 줄라 게디들 주구진 어다 디레샤스 된 주구주구도야지 세부지는 문제 지야지 다디 내 시유비 나오는 직지
Therefore, if such a self were to exist, now if it existed, well, it's kind of like if you think of if there was a thief, so you were to ask, how does that, what kind of thief is that? How does that thief, who is that thief? Is it a human being? Is it a person? Is the thief better or not? What kind of person is it? So here in this case, it's just kind of a rough kind of identification only. It's not necessary to know all these details with regard to the grasping onto the self, that self-grasping awareness, that sense of there being a self that you can actually literally point at. So that needs to be identified. It's important that this self-grasping awareness which arises in one's own continuum, that one is able to identify it properly. So as Geshe-la talked about 4 points yesterday, that is the first point.
That the Kondo sayu kata, jingna shuqingbu yuyu kata, ani charzu di dawa yina, salbu munjin jiye la kibri yori dini sungda.
So therefore, at the time when you get angry, for example, at the time of great anger, so therefore at that time, one should get like a clear, so as it says here, one should get like a clear sense or a clear mental image of what appears to the mind.
Dini jitibaji, dine nipa dila, dine rangshin tenza yuwa na, chikdan tadeli mida yu cui dangs. Dane ta tenze rangshin chardang lola zingi yuwa di mocha chadi di zimba na shinji yuwa na, lola rangi nguyo chuba na wana shinji yuwa na, rangshin tenza yuwa na, ani rangshin ki chubi ta chikdan tadeli ganglo yingu uri hes, ta di ta chuya di nipa che. Ta diya chir ani yuwa chinje dila yana chik, yana ni sim ta tadeli chikda tadeli ma himbi yu chulchi, ta mewa di sewu charu wara. Karesi na, ani pumbada kawa kaga resi. Karchini kebar duruslar wada. Pumbada pumba, ani chigri kaga resi na, chigri lagirwa. Karchini kebar chaya mi duwas. Ladu ita kebar chaya me na chigri. Yu na, ani tade chasadu, ani kebar chaya yorwe ladu ita kazum de na mato, len kaya yu chinje chig tade nisu kanzam chigudwa. Tadi kanzam chaya na, ani rangwani chuba siya tila yang, rangi ngwani yu chinje, yana rangi ngwani chigdu yu gore, rana rangi ngwani tade du yu gores, di nisu kanzam chaya gores. Oda di che, nipa di che.
So then it continues in the next line, and it says, then focus on how, if there were such an intrinsically existent person, it could only be one with or different. So one with or different. So it could only be one or different. So what this means is here that having identified the sense how this self exists, what the self is, now if it really existed, if hypothetically it were to exist, it could only be one or different from the aggregates. So therefore here, there's no other possibility than being one or different from those. So therefore, in the same way when we talk about a pot and a pillar, so the pot is different from the pillar. The pot or the vase is different from the pillar. But pot is one with pot. Pot is identical with pot. So therefore, in this kind of relationship, being different from or being one with, if something existed, if something were to exist intrinsically, it could only be intrinsically existent one or intrinsically different from the aggregate. So we need to decide, we need to have that kind of decision, we need to come to that kind of certainty as to those being the two possibilities. So therefore, if something exists from its own side, it exists from its own side as one with the aggregate, or it exists from its own side as different from the aggregate. That's the only possibility.
Tati kanzam chayani, ane di nichar ke lambala, Niji Yulu, Star Ranshingi to be Jigi Lame, Niji Yudeva, Ranshingi to be Tade Dushane, Dicta Medeva. What that tea, again, Niji Yuludi, Michever Sums, Shosho Zama Imbaji, touch of Virginia, by some Damores. Ranshingi to be Tade Dushana, to give me to see as my labor, Kim Zengi Tone. Ranshingi to be Jishana, to give me to see my labor to pay Michever Sums.
So then it goes on to say that if we've decided therefore that it has to be one, if something exists on its own side, it has to be one of those two, we now need to see what are the logical inconsistencies. How does it contradict? What is the contradiction if it was truly existent, if it was truly existently, it was truly or inherently one with the five aggregates, or it was truly different from the five aggregates? What would be the logical inconsistencies in both these positions? So the word here is to focus on, to really pay attention to what those would be, what those inconsistencies would be. Would it be okay? If not, why is it not okay that something is truly one or different?
Jizanta dila chidi karesena ani rangi mwene tapena pumbadam pumbichashe an wada ngai subu ta pumbadam pumbi towa dini chena chidan chigri taderesena tade chadeyorwa pagi pumbadi chachenji pumbi towa de chasheji du ta ninchadorwa tade chadorwa inayang ta rangi mwene tade ina yurgi mwene tade ina 안 뭐에 줄을 타대이나 루이 철수디 파 샤비 토네 아니 코 타대 인당지 거와 자 루이 철수디 파 샤니 아니 콘중이 타대도 소나 아니 갈라버다 제메기 타대도 차루고 뭐 타대 차루고
So if we talk about something existing from its own side, so let's take for example the pot or the vase. So the vase and the belly of the vase, those two are like one is the part of the other, and they're different from each other. Likewise, the self and the aggregates of the self. So the part of the self, which are the aggregates and the self are different. So in reality, we say that they are different. The vase and its belly, they are different. But if the vase were to exist from its own side, if it were to exist in reality or were to exist inherently, then there would be only this possibility that it would be either, well, if it is different, then it would be truly different. So therefore that means that the vase and its belly, if they are not just by way of appearing to the awareness, if one were to leave that aside, and it would truly be different, then it would mean that the vase and its part, the belly, would be totally disconnected. They would be of a different nature.
다 야나메나 아니 유코랑기 뭐네 아니 타데 두송여나 아니 콘존이를 들어와샤도 말했어. 재미있는 차도 그래. 경쟁 가르에서는 아니 들어와디 도에팅도 요르베 분배팅도 요르베 신다지기 땡도 요래. 또 제도도 들어와디 샤도고 말이야. 디체선 재미 차도도
Therefore, if the phenomenon, if the vase and the belly, etc., if they were to exist from their own side, and they were to be truly, therefore they would be truly existently different. If they are truly existently different, if they're inherently different, then we cannot posit any relationship, any connection between the two of them. Because the relationship, the connection between the two of them can only be posited based on the pot, or it can be based on the belly, or on something else. But this cannot be, it's not based on any of those, so therefore there is really no connection, there's no relation between the two.
Andrea Pumbada, Bichashis, Kibrchedi, Louis Chersutan, Teju, Sulkuando Jinta, Kibrio, Suzugatona. 디분바레 디분베 도와스 로가니 두 체투입니다. 딱가선 리포트 조사와 주구주가 주나 로가지 주구주도입니다. 지수다 kebar yuare soso re ine soso shahedi longor shaba lui wang shaba zama to pagi yurgi kane yurgi mwene soso chetu mido.
So then, with respect to the vase, the pot, the vase, and its parts. So there, the pot and vase, their kind of relationship, it actually just exists from the side of the awareness. It appears, it exists by way of appearing to an awareness. As we've seen yesterday, the vase and its belly, you cannot really find some separateness there if you look for it as we've done yesterday. So when you kind of look for it, you can't find something that is truly separate. So therefore, we say that from the side of the object, the vase and its belly are not truly different.
Tidadu, lui cherchu di pa shani tana, ane kunzuni da sosor cheye midwa. 타디 인장 시에면도 디 매인장 관료의 처치디 파샤니 아니 권한기 문에 뭐직도 줘요나 차 탐진의 직도 줘줘 그래서는 타디 인장직 시에면도 그래서 타디 인장들 동을 계시나 모두 유기된 시에면도 딜레도 유기된 뭐직도 줘요나 레이타슨 게 기제 매비 토네 레이체스디 파샤비 토네 뭐직도 줘요나 넘버 탐지도 찍으려 넘버 탐지도 찍으려나 아니 하기도 못돼 뭐라.
So if we cannot be found saying such stuff, if we leave aside the vase and its belly being different, that just being a mere appearance to the awareness, if we leave aside that fact, then there's no way in which we can actually say they're different. So then, if they're not different, well, all it can be is that they're identical. They're exactly the same. So they have to be exactly identical. They have to be one from the side of the object. Totally identical, totally the same.
因为今天如果不从心显的角度去谈的话，我们就没有办法区分它们的差异，当然就完全变成一，就变成体性一。那因此，如果从这个角度来看的话呢，平跟平底，分跟也分，有值变成体性一的话呢，一切法都会变成一。当我们说到一切法都变成一的时候，就有非常多的理路可以去伤害它。
接着他的确的，아니 미체버 삼라 뉴지 토잉에 버장신스다 자신 주비지다 다들 가르켜내 보인다 뉴지 유버디 이시 정보체 안 디터 디게 딩가마마 마제버진 거로 마마마 제사는 팽거 말 마마마 마제버진은 디슈디 수제니 다다 파라 안타 아니 간사라 자신 중세게 매도 님비 니버 때버찬데스 랑 유튜브 민두 님도다 타제 인들 냠버샤고 말
So therefore then it goes on to say, therefore develop certainty about these inconsistencies. So these inconsistencies that you previously have come to a conclusion about, so something that you understood. And then finally consolidate your certainty that therefore the person does not exist intrinsically to the slightest dictation. So therefore whatever you come to, whatever understanding you come to, you need to develop certainty about it.
讲到后不忘前行的这样子产生一个坚固的定解，当定解坚固之后呢，再让我们的心安住在这个我们产生的定解上面。所以，当坚固定解不再结为全无自性。
但第几句在呢？其他多年关闭够了，你多年国外也不嘛差别忘记，你开始甚至真正没不进呢，你这样一两没进，对你这有的，第三年都国外差3年几个，大家老板那些进了关闭去了，那些主办民都。 생타제니 아니 데스 고면디 아니 가차 카시지진라 라신도 민두체 가차 카시지 제라 아니 가게 딩규민 동상상치 야치야 이름이 제가 텐드 고가 요래 그 신기 요래데 이내 파기 야치야 이지 제가 텐드야지 제가 담배가다 라신도 민두 님도 니바케니 니바디간의 균부 샤기 말이스 데스 야 고네마 슈디 데스 냠도도 야 고네 다 권에 양교 디진도 대응하면 실례를 전에 이런 거 걸고 말아. 교수 너를 찾을 텐데 지래. 다 디나시 유나 하나씩 좀 타지 가는도 두고 그래. 지도 전에 지금도 더 전에 조금도 제사다 라기 조초지면도 쓰냐. 디 미시지다. 야 대신에 말이야. 다 도스 교육다 도스 사유다. 아니 민두 냠도 예바게디 아니 링두 저로 가리다.
So, with respect to now meditating in emptiness, of course there is, for some people what happens is that there's a sense nothing is there. So they may fall into the extreme of nihilism in the sense of nothing to mind. So nothingness appears to the mind. So in order to really train in the correct understanding, so what happens is that initially there may be a sense the phenomenon does not exist inherently, but then very shortly afterwards there may be a sense it doesn't exist at all. So in order to avoid falling into such an extreme of nihilism, one should only for a short time focus on that phenomenon and the fact that phenomena do not exist inherently to avoid falling into the extreme of nihilism. Because sometimes, as you said, you have a sense of emptiness and then sometimes a sense of nothingness. So just a short time, initially get a sense for a short time that phenomena do not exist from by way of their own, from their own side. Otherwise, that understanding may deteriorate. So then, if there's a sense, just briefly one focuses on emptiness itself, the lack of intrinsic or inherent existence, one does that initially only for a short time. Then one goes over the whole thing again. If the phenomenon were to exist inherently, then it could only be inherently one or inherently different from the aggregate. So if it existed as inherently one with the aggregate, this would be the problem. This would be the logical inconsistency. If it were to exist as inherently different from the aggregate, that would be the logical inconsistency. So going through the reasoning again and again, and then after having gone through this reasoning, so therefore phenomena do not exist inherently. And one focuses again for a short time, before one falls again to the extreme of nihilism, and then slowly one repeats this over and over again, in the same way as one were to recite a mantra, one does it again and again, and slowly those periods on which, during which one focuses on the lack of inherent existence are lengthened. So one lengthens those periods, and then before falling into extreme nihilism, one does the whole thing over again.
아니 가서 그래 고아라바 zam기 토네 아니 삼나당 바이네 때 팬딩이 되지도 요구를 봐. 되게 콘도서디 디삼단디 때 쇼를 줘서 디스더디 맹문의 사회는 지거 말해. 맹기 timmak하니 때 팬도서로 줘라. 이것도 지거 말. 동원에 디네 안에 장이 중생기 토네 타신기 딱 디마도 줬어 민도 삼년냐 벌써 대신에 심팅네 파게 내 탁주를 선버지기 수수랑기 다 담보디 가르스나 페르지버드즈 랍샤조로와 랍샤조디 있는 주기다 디 제수 장이다 수수기 세탑지고로 다 디네 아니 랍샤조디 계제데 많이 수수랑기 섬료토 나로네 아니 메타주리 선비는 섬료디 내용도 딘디디기 아니 신에 폐 공원에 디디는 조리와 제산다 딘디기 토네 아니 라신이 좀 초색이 매도 슬라디자네 아니 가시에다 아니 장하기에 저거 가시에다 가능기에 저거 되게 연구있으라 들어왔는데 아니 밖에 미주셔야 저거다 위기바보다 해 저거다 되게 소화지 연구있으라 지단다 소화자마다 시리시리 이체에다 개요말 고타메다로 이내 그 소화점기 토다 이체도 요말데 이내 나로네 니버지니나 양 소화도 추용돼야지 아니 가시기 이시에지나 아니 가능 장나 가야민도나 다달로라 세워 차요 말이스 동초디 고아디 야나 장나 리기리 야나 가나 리기리스 가시기 된디 순구였어 이니 차바 유미 강시
So then, if one has gotten a sense for this, if one has gotten some understanding of what emptiness, of what that ultimately is, first just that kind of notion, that sense, there's definitely some small benefit. So if one gets angry, for example, there is probably a slight lessening of that type of anger. But that is only very small, that kind of getting some sense of what emptiness refers to, which comes from the outside. That's a little bit like just smelling at the medicine and feeling better right away. Instead of taking the medicine, one just sniffs at the medicine and smells the medicine and feels a little better. But one needs to mend whatever reasons that have been presented by someone else. one needs to think of those reasons again and again and mentally absorb into those reasons, really absorb into them, get a real sense of these different reasons. It's really like that. Come to the conclusion, it is really like that. Because usually these reasons that are told by another person, some other person tells us with these reasons, we just accept those. We just go, yeah, that makes sense. In that moment we see that it makes sense and accept it. But it's not enough to just do that, because it needs to come from our own mind. We need to get a first-hand kind of conviction by going over this again and again, such that by way of our own mind, due to our own reflection and contemplation on this, we ourselves think really there's nothing there. There's this kind of first-hand kind of understanding that comes from one's own mind. That is truly beneficial. And so when one has that kind of deep understanding, it is said that some people get fearful, fear arises. Some people, it's described as having delight, joy is created in the mind. For others, tears come from their eyes, and the hairs on their body start ending, some stand on end. So therefore, just the fact that they have certain feelings, that's not important really. What is more important is that from within, their understanding creates a certain feeling. So the understanding creates a certain feeling. That's important. So whatever the feeling is, but additionally says that it is said that some people say that if there's no feeling at all, that means there's no understanding. Geshe-la says, I'm not sure that's really the case. Anyhow, usually some people say there's usually two kinds of reactions upon this really deep understanding. Either there's happiness, there's delight arising in one's mind, or there's fear.
当然，我们不能够完全从这种外表的感受来谈，但主要谈的是什么？就是你必须要有感受，让你的这个认知从你的心底产生出来才行。
디네 영양 선비 긴기 아니 곰시 수수 곰시의 자제 안 치도니는 선마다비 갑래 랑긴 한기 그런 톤도 아니 그런 하신 주민도 선파기 선 코르트웨지 딘지지도 다 담보들의 퇴중이 고아스니 지 생기 치료 디바지네 추이나 추 칼 또 스킬데마도 딩나마 수딩이 되지 니버들의 삼중이 요하스니 딩니 깨바 임바지라 수수기 강전의 쇠샤주를 그렇지. 아니 숨바들라 아니 쇠샤주 많이 말한게 강기 끼에 디제온도 남샤 균댕기 섬로들라니 그렇게 돼야지. 신200 값수 이내 균댕기 섬로를 그렇게 되게래데 아니 직지도 갈라 미니 메서를 냐버샤도 아니 베톤이랑이 나저와 첨부지체 아니 남샤 당산 칠로르도 야 남샤 균댕기 미디랑체 미니 메서를 다 공직 디추 자니 이규기 용화디 주마마 이미 용화 때스키 온데 남샤 균댕기 아니 섬로들 기와 태지 아니 조선님도 저런 참원을 다 그슈니 태용해야지.
And thinking again and again. So at some point, due to this constant thinking, this constant familiarity, naturally, without actually making an effort, without bringing these different reasonings to mind, one will naturally think that phenomena do not exist inherently. So there are these three stages basically. First, there is the result that is arising from listening. So kind of a resultant state that is the resultant state which has arisen from listening. That's a little bit like touching the surface of water without going deeply within. So just touching the surface. And the next step is the kind of resultant state one reaches, which is a result arisen from contemplation. So here oneself actually creates something. It comes from one's own effort, that was something that's kind of created. And then the last step, really meditate, some kind of experience of meditation is created, then arises natural. The sense of what reality will arise naturally in one's mental continuum, and real change can take place. So with regard to the second step here, so the result of the state of mind that arises as a result of contemplation, that's a little bit like two people. It's like a kind of split personality in the sense that while you're meditating, while you're thinking about it, it makes total sense and your mind is kind of transformed. However, when you get up, you're your old self again. So you're like a different person again. So it's a bit like two people, like a split personality. However, with regard to the third step of meditation, when you have that kind of experience of meditation, then it will always be there. The kind of change will always be there. It will not change back, and your nature will be changed. It will be influenced by your meditation. Your actual character, your personality will be transformed.
영화 텐단디 이 자고에 가르치는 이 텐데 가시 텐지기도 아니 준주스 빌리우드즈 파게 로티 데스코하르 유딩이 텐지기 아니 근데도 상로치니 매버체 아니 콘도사 칸이 알마디마 차디 아니 신이 아니 준주 비자모야 파게 데브루르다 파게 니마 셰샤주 코샤주드즈 아니 니엔제 펜데 펭게스르 디게 데스트 펭게스르 인 디지디 가르쳐 차기도 쓰나 아니 파게 맨다다 두서 쇠싱해지게 쇠지 더티지는 매버체 아 파게는 마다도 레온데 아니 신에 아니 지쇠지 디지기서 아니 카티카티 기자로다 제가 딜레코 당원이네 근데는 파게 뭐뉴나마 되비 파게 다 감정한 주 가리는 지 검제 엔베 디 냐마주버제 담보때 데스 거그르 사보 검디 디체다 ko chuzi nanglo le di nubadi manyambachi nya des chemba yine nubadi rangcha nya thogro so ko gyunen du du suyo na ani shine phagi khashe le ung du sane ko samba zamji ko kama khashi sama tang ba da nam sama ye zhe chi di yong thogro
So the reason I'm talking about this, talking about this kind of experiential meditation, familiarity here, why am I saying that? Because there's something, why am I stressing this or emphasizing this? Well, because some people say that when they study, for example, the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva, when they study the chapter on patience, then yes, it definitely has a benefit right away when they read about it. But as they then read the book aside and don't really necessarily deepen their understanding of that, when they meet some kind of circumstance, such as like someone makes them angry, they right away need to take the book again, go through the chapter again, check out again what it says in there, or they have to take the tape recorder, the recording of the teachings that they received on this teaching in order to be able to deal with the situation. That's a little bit like ordinarily you would prepare a weapon to go to war. First you kind of produce the weapon, and then you're ready when the war starts to be able to fight. But this is a little bit like, oh, you notice, oh, the war is starting, oh, I quickly get to get my weapons together, and you start producing the weapons up from the beginning of the war. So that is like, you're not prepared for when the situation actually arises. So therefore, again, I'm saying that you should, from the beginning, be prepared in the sense that you spend some time, 15, 20 minutes meditating. So first it takes some time, to get used to those ideas, to habituate, familiarize yourself with those. But then at some point it comes naturally. It becomes something that innately, whenever a kind of object of obstacle or any kind of situation arises, that then right away you're able to think in the proper way. You're prepared and you're able to react properly.
아니 사고도야 걸라고래 단다디 딘디 이미 좀 생기 아니 장바인다 다 고할 때서 대서리 딘디 인상으로 신메스 도스니 장의 중들 때다 민들 아니 디다지 야 디나시 딘디 연락 중인 기지 시원하시 동해지 중바이나 동해디 자와 가와 투레 아니 내 모노 투레 용기 자와 가와 투레 다 달라 차와 디 자와 당진의 투 제사는 단신디 기신유디 민두스 제제 리버터부터 도 세워이나 때 개구전은 된다 연다 중인의 워와 디진 디정도 때셔 뒤전에 아니 가리용 거래서나 세디자 마세 교와 제만이 보이네 강의 태양도 니만 검시디 강의를 가릴 때는 중시었어 아니 유몬 때는 중시 유몬이 가릴 때는 중시 안 단진 때는 중시 안 단진이 지만은 요래 요 말이지 그 방팅의 조주물 다디 니만이 검시 제상 안에 디나신 되게 된데 이미 좀 생기 아시면 뭐 상당히 된데다 가지고 있는 지 통대 샤되어라 된데라고 규단데 견 깨버데 아 디규다 견데 가르스키 디케나 아니야 라신 주지리 다데리는 나는 코치 삼로디 디 공배왕이 조주해지 제상 아니 기기 매네 돈이도 전투에 교와죠 된데 숨겨
同样的，当我们学习到
So in particular, what is important is to think of dependent arising, to take dependent arising as the reason, use that as the reasoning, one's logical reasoning in order to establish that phenomena do not exist by way of their own nature, that they do not exist inherently. So in that way, one gets used to it, one gets used to this idea again and again, reflecting on dependent arising and taking that as the reason for how phenomena really exist. And in particular, with regard to dependent arising, one should take to mind the 12 links of dependent arising. Of when suffering arises, to see what is the cause of that suffering, what led to the suffering, and coming to understand the suffering we experience can be traced back to our afflictions, and those afflictions in turn can be traced back to the root, which is grasping, which is the awareness which grasps at self that doesn't exist. So then one understands that that awareness which grasps at the self, that its referent object actually doesn't exist. The object that this mind grasps at actually doesn't exist. So with familiarity, when we gain familiarity, this is beneficial not just in this lifetime, but also in our next life. That whenever a problem arises due to familiarity, due to being accustomed to this way of thinking, whenever a problem arises, we're able to trace it back to the affliction, and then in turn trace those afflictions back to the misperception with regard to the self. And then be able to analyze, investigate, does its referent object, the main object of that mind that misperceives a self that doesn't exist, does that really exist? So in that way, using dependent arising, and dependent arising here is all around us. For example, the course type of dependent arising, dependence on causes, dependence of causes and conditions, or dependence, causal dependent arising. It's all around us, it's always there. So taking that as a reason, we can then understand that phenomena do not exist inherently. And in that way, even without a teacher, even if we don't have a teacher, we're able to reflect, we can contemplate on those things, not just in this life, but also in our future life.
다 디제네 디가나 다 갈라버 우마다 인미도 다 데스코 최그레 디디치도 시시때 제지 삼처치 디체웨이나 아니 지다 두제디 다 자외 전신 주시도 도만이나 간성 최사로 딩이 되고 이내 디게르 땅인데 아니 다 된다 그게 디디키지시니 자와시라나이나 마체 그와 우마 주변 나로라 다 된기지시 디지디 디낭로네 그게 마스 타드니 마송인데 담보디 풍부 다인 바세 장가도스테워 아니 레시닝고 나로라 라신 찍다 타데다 소바 딘스 타드니 장가제도 담보디 라신 찍스 장가자요 디지디 라몬드 주비 찍도 짐바세 라바지 셰고 타디 지금 다시 단자는 요를 알게 셰고 제로 라바지 셰고 라바디 풍부 다도 짐바 다가라 라신 주비 찍도 짐바디 인서에 선택 그래서나 다기라고 나시 딜러네 가가실을 풍부 다 짐바스 가가실을 라신 찍 승민다도 딩이디 내지 인서에 신기 찍도 짐바다 풍부 다도 짐바 다 풍부다가 신기 찍도 짐바다 아니 풍부 다도 짐바
on top of that, or additionally to that, to those who study Madhyamika, those who study Uma, so they will know about this, that after one has contemplated, one has analyzed whether phenomena, has come to understand that if something were to exist intrinsically, it would have to be a truly existent one or truly existent different on its part. So coming then to an understanding that phenomena are empty of, or their lack of being truly existent one and being truly existent different from its part, one can understand that fact, one can take it further. Because one can then go into the 7 types of extremes, as in like, if something were to exist, there would be these 7 types of absurdity. And since those 7 points are not there, since phenomena are empty of those 7 points, then the phenomenon cannot exist inherently. So according to Nagarjuna's root wisdom, there's only 5 kind of absurdities that he puts forth, but according to Chandrakirti's supplement to the middle way, there's 7. So the first of those 7 is that the aggregates and the self are not intrinsically one. So in the eloquent speech by Lama Tsongkhapa also says, he says, being intrinsically one, and so forth, the 7. So the 7, such as being intrinsically existent one. So here Geshe-la said that being intrinsically one is actually apprehending something as being intrinsically existent one. In other words, the aggregates and the self being intrinsically one is the same as perceiving the aggregate as being the self. So he's saying that seems to be the same kind of apprehension than when you have a mind that perceives the self and the aggregates as intrinsically one. That is the same as that mind perceiving the aggregates being the self.
That dichiduzane, ani 자외 ani 풍부디 말에 대리 된신 말에 시디 타죄자리디 이내 정신 주부 진보디 숙친구 쉬우지여디 단디로 마대와치. 디치두잖아요. 로마대와 레용두잖아요. 다오나 안 풍부디 말에 대리 된신도면은 간디드레스. 근데 저거 당연도 가장 지금 뭐지 진행이 디치에서 완전 밖에 조지시스디. 조지시스디 라마트바나 신치디 디리베디 말에 일다두잖다. 목사세드레스. 뭐지에서 다디 디소저지. 다델 풍부디 말에 대리 로스요 말에 시디 아니 라바디 수이르 un subu di sud, sem di sud, di yue de sagi doas, sabu yomarta kiji, di ten de sagi doas, di dares, dos mojichi, tembaran sing to zimas, rabadi. Tensa, tembas in habor, one labota ten, labachin, labota ten, or labotensa, pungu di tensa, do all the dares.
So then, therefore, as we have understood that the actual aggregates, they are not the self, and the self does not exist as separate from them. We've kind of understood that intellectually, but if we have very strong innate grasping as an inherently existing self, there's a sense of discomfort. We will not be totally comfortable with the idea that the self cannot be found. So then there will be the thought, how does it then exist? How can it exist? So we had that idea before. Initially, or some days ago, we examined what is the table, how does the table exist, what is it? So it's not this, it is not that, etc. But then it is that on which we can put the cup. It is that the basis on which we can put the cup. So this is kind of the conclusion we came to. And likewise with regard to the hand. So what is it that possesses the hand? What is it that possesses the consciousness? We ask that. Whose is it? Whose consciousness is it? Whose hand is it? Etc. Well, it is that part. It is that part. So that is what we come to that kind of conclusion with that.
Tina Shin, any me tone la telling ye tongues like it was, la visual telling ye shoe like it was, and this Tina Shin in the country, Pumbo the thing the hinge to di dare se to. Yanamena, any that chashi di chashin the temper chin, 풍고디 댄서지도 디다레세 어디디 있어서 저기 다들 라고 찍고도
So then, likewise, when my eyes see something, I say I see. When my hand hits someone, I say I see. I hit. So when my hand hits someone, when I just hit someone, I say I hit someone. So therefore, there is someone, there's a self that exists, there's something that depends on the aggregates. There's a part possessor that depends on the parts. So this is a kind of rough way of looking at it.
That DJ, today, don't show that there's Mandu chance. The DJ need that. I'm going to do Nebita, the short this or Buchang. Today, don't show never the days this one. And then, Kansagi Tiny, you but now on you to chat to shoot us. That one to some like this one say. 미다 도와서 그는 콜을 제송 말을 제송 가가도와 콜을 쉬수 말을 쉬수 스킵을 도와도 어디 조파기를 제거체 된지기 아니 너희도 차도 쉬라 된지기 차대야디 차대 가장 님마다 돼야 되면 다 뭐지 제용도 차대야디 세지 이 레서바보다 지금 용어로 조비 된지기 처럼 이들 자신스 아니 자신 매바다 텐제 TV 텔루남다 예바니가 샤고스
So then the text continues where it says practice this aspect of emptiness often. So practice this aspect often in the sense that one needs to get a good, kind of clear understanding of this emptiness aspect. And then the text continues, then bring to mind the person or the conventional person who undeniably appears. So the self undeniably appears. So that person here, the self that appears, there's a difference between, of course, say the I and another person. So I hit someone, or he hits someone. I did something, he did something. There's a difference. So the self that appears, that self that appears to ourselves, that we identify, that self, so turn your mind to, then with regard to that, turn your mind to dependent arising, wherein that person is posited as the accumulator of karma and the experiencer of effect.
那必须呢，我们在心中呢去确立出，我们其实有这个所谓的所显现的。那接着看到，令于心显及安以此为造业者及受活者，作意思维诸缘起品，于不自信缘起得成，于成立理当会地止。
심해보다 텐제 TV 가상치 라이브를 연결시 뒤치기. 난 뒤치기 전에 배당 원소 뒤 남문에 내봐는 기재 시에봐이나 텐제 TV 텐제 비주치기를. 아니 개인원이 파야고 시부지인디 관시 코마는 막아 제대로 세도 텐제 TV 비주치기를.
So with respect to when we say something does not exist from the side of the object, so when we explain that and we use these words, we're taking the example when we say and we actually express the following. I did that person, I really benefited that person a lot, but they still don't like it and do not like it. When we say that sentence, we use that sentence. I benefited them, but they don't like it.
如果这一方面已经好好的善用它的这个如我这一方面这几个字。
나 정말 음식에 대해 숨어도 가서 그래 우리는 부터는 당신이 뱅기 뒤걸 숨도 아니 프랑스 알랭을 가르치면 마대비 따서를 레바지 잡으러 그거 줘야 다 간지 그거 줘면 마대비 프랑스 문에 그거는 같이 제거했어 지금 비슷합니다 어디 남기 폐기를 비슷한데 맞수용 문에 예 문에 관한기 문에
So as His Holiness usually says, when His Holiness gives an explanation, so from the point of view of transformation, so for example, if we do not change, if they do not transform, it doesn't matter. We from our own side need to transform. So His Holiness uses this kind of word. So from one's own side, one needs to do something. These words are useful for one's side.
awareness.
So from the side.
Awareness is the teaching. Chesa, till the Duzaneta, 가리라고 쪽지라고 있나 쪽지 코랑기 뇌네 예바 있나 코랑기 뇌네 아니 유수지 거래 코랑기 뇌네 유수지 예바 있나 다 규진나 소리 최신다디 매나양 그 유튜브지 거래 또 그래서 코랑면이 유수지 여러 코랑면이 유수지에나 규진기 유수지 마힘비 유수지도 제산의 규진나 소바 매네 그 유튜브지 거래 규진의 소바 매네 그 유나 한 규진의 뜻에 지고 그러나 규진 매네 그 유튜브에는 한 규진 맞추는 거를 돼 요청으로 제산 규진의 뜻에 지금 찍는다.
So when we say from the side of the object, so from the side of himself or from the side of the object, something existed or having to exist from the side of the object. So that means if something exists from the side of the object, then even there are no causes and conditions that give rise to the object, still the object will have to be there. So the object would still exist. There would be a mode of existence from the side of the object, and so even if there, so that you don't need really any causes and conditions that give rise to that object because it exists from its own side. And even if these causes and conditions were not there, you would still have an object. So therefore, if it does not exist from the side of the object, it has to depend on those causes and conditions. But if it doesn't depend on any causes or conditions, in other words, if it does exist from its own side, it does not have to depend on causes and conditions other than that.
탄주와 마잉이 두지 가리삼고 가리시나 조지디 코랑기 뇌네 매나 매바이나 코랑 뇌네 똥바이나 코랑기 뇌네 제고라는 신차바이나 아니 줄을 때는 게 콜을 때는 시다들 때는 충마들 때는 채와 나는 지그 납세기 시커라미도 왔어 진짜 때버들 이거죠 코랑 뇌네 짜와니네 매바이나 지금 때문에 지금 콜을 때문에 지금 납세기 시커라미 차리 그때인데 지금도 왔어 이 수디라고
So other than the followers of the Madhyamika and Pasamhika, the lower kind of philosophers, they say